So I am delighted to welcome our guest today, Dolly Chugh, who is the Jacob B. Milnick Term Professor at the Stern School of Business at NYU. Dolly's first book, The Person You Mean to Be, introduced me to the notion of being goodish. That's the idea that gives you room to become a better person without the burden of needing to be perfect all the time or immediately. And her new book, A More Just Future, which comes out on Tuesday, we'll be putting the link to that in the chat as well, continues in that spirit of navigating the path towards becoming a better person, this time by confronting the imperfections in the country that you love. It's incredibly timely. She started writing it long before everybody was talking about critical race theory being taught in schools, but it is so relevant to so many of the controversies and discussions that we're having today. The book uses psychological science to guide us along that journey, but it's also incredibly warm and personal. And it opens with this story about Dolly, your family's visit to the setting of one of your favorite books or book series, The Little House on the Prairie. And so that's where I wanted to start by asking you to tell us about that. I just want to note for the audience that you will also have the chance to ask questions in the last 10 or 15 minutes. So please put those in the Q&A box and I will get to as many of those as possible. But welcome, Dolly. Thank you so much for being here. And yeah, tell us about the Little House on the Prairie story and how it relates to your book.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you to the whole team, Zeitgeist and BCFG, for having me here. I was told there would be jokes, Dave.
Yes, there's a joke. I almost forgot. That's what I was supposed to start with at the beginning.
I mean, me. Back to you.
I hope I didn't let Katie down, because Katie's the master of those jokes. She'll be watching this recording when she gets a chance. So this is a joke for my kids, their favorite knock knock joke.
Okay.
Knock knock.
Who's there?
The interrupting cow.
The interrupting cow.
Boo!
Oh, God.
My kids are 8 and 11, but I think it's a timeless classic.
Interrupting cow. That's good. I'm going to use that at home tonight. I love it.
All right.
Great.
Yeah, it's an easy one.
It's an easy one. But your timing was
right. You have to be quick, right? If you're not quick enough.
Timing. Yeah. No, that was good.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So speaking of kids, as you mentioned, when I was a kid, I, like millions of other people, loved the Little House on the Prairie book series, and there was a TV show. And when I became a parent, I was really excited to read these books to my kids. And so, in fact, for those who aren't familiar, it's a book series that's written by Laura Ingalls Wilder about her family growing up in the 1800s. You know, sort of when the sort of what we now call Minnesota and South Dakota was indigenous land, and then her family and many other families moved in and sort of fought the elements to sort of build a life. And I was very entranced with this family, and I wanted to share them with my children, and all the values of patriotism and hard work and love of family. And so we, every night for a year, read, it's 8 books, 200 plus pages each. Every night for a year, when my kids were about 6 and 7, I read to them from the book series. So much so that, like, I think my kids actually thought, like, Laura was their sister. Like, when they would draw pictures of our family, like Laura would be in there somehow, mysteriously. And so we got so immersed in this, we decided to do a family vacation where we would go to where the real Ingalls family lived, and we would, go to the homestead, and we would see the spots and everything. And so we did that for a week, and it was like phenomenal. It was like, I mean, I was totally patting myself on the back for like parenting prowess, because it was affordable. The kids had a blast. They wore little prairie dresses every day. The pictures were awesome. And it was like all this educational content that I was bestowing upon my kids. I do remember, though, there were points in that trip where I was, because we were literally there looking at the land, looking at this big prairie sky. And I remember being like, wait, who lived here before? And like having these like little nudgy ideas, and then just shutting them down in my head, because it was like, I don't know how to think about that. I have built up a whole narrative here. I don't know what to do with this different perspective. And so I just pushed it away, didn't discuss it with my kids. And in the decade that has passed since, I keep going back to that and thinking about why I pushed it away. Why didn't I present my kids with a perspective about the Native American families that were also fighting the elements, whose land was taken, whose lives were taken, that we had, 60 million Native Americans reduced to 6 million Native Americans over a period of time in our country. And I realized that what was kind of coming up for me was I just didn't know how to handle that emotionally. Like, it just was sort of emotionally like confusing. There was shame and guilt and like, that can't be true. They were good people. And I wasn't even at the point of being worried about whether my kids can handle it. And the truth is they could have handled it, because kids very much understand fair play and you took my thing, and that, they get that. But it was my lack of tools for dealing with my own emotions that stopped me from doing that. And as a result, I laid on my kids' lap the burden of having to unlearn what I taught them as they go through life, because what I taught them was true. The Ingalls family was an amazing family. The Ingalls family was also part of a colonizing force that has created a country where we have massive disparities now between the people that were displaced and their descendants and those who did the displacing. And I wish I had given my kids a fuller understanding. So I have written A More Just Future because I needed to read a book like that would help me, give me some evidence-based psychological tools to reckon with whitewashed history like that, as I both sort of myself unlearn some things and support others like my kids.
All right. Well, so we're gonna get to even like that nudgy feeling first. I think that like where you don't even see it, because your book's broken back down into these 3 parts that are really kind of usefully break it down. How do we start? What do we do? And where do we go from here? And so I want to ask you about each of them, and I want to start with this idea that it can be difficult, it can be challenging to even see it, because you're worried about, or as soon as you see it, you push it away. You never really confront it, and without seeing it, it's really hard, obviously, to deal with it. So you talk about something called the Patriot's Dilemma. So tell us a little bit about what is the Patriot's Dilemma, and how does it relate here?
So what I've been calling the Patriot's Dilemma captures this ironic dynamic where the more we are invested in and sort of deeply love our country and this particular narrative around the United States, you can apply this to other countries as well. I'm an American, so that's the perspective I wrote this book from, but you can pivot to other situations. That the more you are deeply invested in this sort of patriotic love of country, the harder it might be, the more of a dilemma it might be to see what isn't working in our country and to address it going forward. And there's research that's looked at things like the degree of historical continuity or discontinuity we see, and that refers to how connected do I see the past and the present. People vary in how much historical continuity they see. And what studies show is that when people feel a lot of historical continuity, they're very invested in that past and the present, then it becomes much more difficult to sort of deal with challenges to the identity that you care deeply about. And so the Patriot's Dilemma is the problem we're trying to solve here, in that how can I not sit with only the Instagrammed version of my country, but the real version of my country?
Yeah, because that's what's really there. At the end, I'm going to get to this version of the gritty patriot that you talk about.
Yeah.
Before we get there, you tell these 2 different stories about people going back and looking at their genealogy and learning about who their ancestors were in a way that, is not necessarily flattering, that I think connects well here. So one of them is Anderson Cooper, and the other is Ben Affleck, and they handle it in different ways. So I wanted you to tell me a bit more about that and what it tells us about how we can approach this in a constructive or sometimes less constructive way.
Absolutely. Yeah. And this is a great build off of the Patriots Dilemma, because these are two people who, like me and like many people listening, love our country deeply, would definitely identify as people who love the United States, but approached a situation on the TV show Finding Your Roots very differently. So this TV show, for those who aren't familiar, is on PBS, and it's hosted by Henry Louis Gates, a professor at Harvard. And it gets into it's one of those like reveal shows where they do this deep dive into the genealogy of a celebrity. And then they present it to them as a book of like, we've uncovered this about your great, great, great grandfather, or we found this bus ticket that your grandmother used to, leave, Memphis to go to New York. Or they really come up with this incredible, rich treasure chest of your past. And they often present it to the person live on camera, not live, but like on camera, and then we get to see how they react to those discoveries. And so there was one episode where Ben Affleck was presented with his past, and the episode that aired showed him, exclaiming how proud he was of sort of certain ancestors who had done some like incredible things and fought the good fight and that kind of thing. And you can see how proud he is. And then later it was leaked through one of those like weird things where like millions of emails get leaked from some unrelated issue, that in those emails were communication between Ben Affleck and the PBS producers, revealing that there were things they had revealed to him about his ancestors having enslaved people that he had asked them to withhold and not. After he learned of it on camera and they had the footage, he asked that it not be aired. There was all sorts of, what should we do? What should we do? Batman doesn't want us to air this. And in the end, they made a decision, which they, I think, have come to regret, to not air it. They normally don't, give the guest that prerogative. In contrast, Anderson Cooper has also been a guest on the show, was also presented with some information of this sort about his family. And what we see in the footage that aired there is this kind of neutrality. I mean, not neutrality about, his ancestor enslaving someone. He's like, that's disgusting, that's awful. But a neutrality of how that reflects back on him. And so I interpreted the difference between the two of them as being that they were able to dress for the weather. Anderson Cooper was able to dress for the weather in a smarter way than Ben Affleck was. Now, I don't know either of these individuals, so I don't know their inner thoughts, but I'm speculating. And what I mean by dress for the weather is just like, when you have an outing planned and you don't bring enough layers, or you don't bring sunblock or whatever, and it ruins your day, or you cut the day short, or you're like, we're never going back there. Like you don't actually sink into the experience. The same thing is, I think, what happened here emotionally for Ben Affleck versus Anderson Cooper. And we know from the research that Dan Gilbert and others have done on affective forecasting, our ability to forecast how intense our emotions will be in the future and how long those emotions will last. We know that we are not good affective forecasters. We will not do a good job. We will overestimate how bad something's going to feel and how long it will feel bad. And my speculation is that Ben Affleck, his affective forecasting was off, particularly around how he believed he would feel after the general public learned of this ancestry of his. And he did not go into the session to begin with emotionally prepared for this roller coaster, whereas Anderson Cooper was a more accurate affective forecaster and more dressed for the weather. The implication of this is that if we go in expecting that Instagram version, it's like with your kids, if you have kids or if you have young people in your life, if you think you're going to go, on vacation with them and expect no bad days and no tantrums, you're not ready for what's coming. There's going to be good days, but there's also going to be things they aren't. It doesn't mean you don't love your children. You just don't always like everything they do. And that will come with some emotional reaction. And what I see in the Ben Affleck, Anderson Cooper example is a failure to dress for the weather on Ben Affleck's part.
Right. So Ben Affleck wasn't expecting necessarily to find that. So which brings me to my next question. When you look back at this country's history, I mean, unless you've really had your head in the sand, that there are things that are going to be right less than perfect.
Yeah.
And so one of the ways that you talk about preparing is this idea that two things can be true at the same time, right?
Yeah.
You have to embrace paradox. I wanted you to talk a little bit more about the idea of embracing paradox.
Yeah. So there's this beautiful research by Wendy Smith, Marianne Lewis. They have a new book out, Both and Thinking, and others, that looks at this this craving our minds have for consistency. That we want the picture on the wall to be straight, kind of thing. We look for consistency, and when we encounter inconsistency, our brain basically tries to solve the puzzle rather than allow the inconsistency to sit. So a paradox is when two statements, both of which are true, contradict each other. Our brains aren't naturally going to embrace that. But what their research shows is that if we simply tell our brains, sometimes there are things that are conflicting but true. In other words, we adopt or embrace a paradox mindset, that we're actually able to kind of loosen up that tension that our brain takes on when it faces inconsistency. And the payoff, according to the research, is pretty significant. We become more creative, we become more resilient, we're able to see possibilities we wouldn't otherwise see, because our brain isn't like using all its fuel to solve the paradox. It's allowing the paradox to simply be. And I think that's so useful when it comes to this idea of how do I think about my country's past, because there's all these paradoxes in American history. There's, for example, our forefathers did extraordinary things, overcame extraordinary odds, wrote extraordinary documents, had an extraordinary vision. All of that is true. And our forefathers, many of them, while they were doing those things, enslaved other human beings, tortured them if they resisted or tried to escape, separated families. And I have to take a deep breath when I say that. I literally just sort of felt my breath tighten, because it's so uncomfortable to think about that and to think about those two truths together.
Yeah.
But if we are able to do that, if we're simply able to tell our brain both of those things can be true, both of them are, I don't have to choose. But if I only will stay with the Instagram version, I will not be able to understand where my country is today, because there's so many ways in which the dots from the past directly connect to the dots of the present. I will not be able to reckon with that, because I won't have both of that, both sides of that paradox available to me mentally.
Right. Without embracing paradox, you have it's black or white, and you pick one, and then you have an incomplete idea of
Exactly.
what the truth is.
Exactly. And I'll just add one more thing to that. And then our brain will make sense of things another way then. So if I'm not able to, for example, understand how the paradox of American history has led to there being, for example, where Black people continue to be on the short end of pretty much every disparity on every meaningful outcome, if I can't see how that ties to systems and structures, cultures and norms that have been part of this entire country's history up until today, not a long time ago only, but up until today, then the way I will make sense of those disparities is to attribute it to something about the people or their culture or their genetics, or I will come up with some other explanation that won't be grounded in the reality, that conflicting truth.
Yeah. So understanding and being able to come to terms with this sort of idea psychologically is a big task.
Yeah.
But then, in the last part of your book, you talk about this article on the case for reparations that Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote, and how you sort of plan to read it, put it aside for a while. But you talked about these tasks of fixing this problem as, again, this is paradoxical, that it's both essential and impossible, and that can be sort of debilitating. You've got this beautiful poem that your daughter wrote that ends with the line, "It'll never be enough, so what's next?" This paradox of it's an insurmountable problem that has to be tackled. And so my question was really, I've read your book now. I've sort of found a better way to think about these things emotionally. I've come to embrace this paradox, but it does seem insurmountable. It seems like, okay, this is not the work of an afternoon or a generation. So how do we roll up our sleeves and begin that work?
Yeah, and I definitely feel the weight of that myself. And in fact, I couldn't even get myself to read that article. I mean, the story I tell in the book is that so there was this very well-regarded, often cited article by Ta-Nehisi Coates, so much so that actually after he published it in the Atlantic, Congress asked him to come testify and speak to it because they found it so meaningful. And like a lot of people in my world were talking about this article, like I was hearing about it all the time. Right. And so I kept printing it out. It was a long article, so I was like, I'm gonna print it, I'm gonna like read it carefully and highlight it. And then I would like set it aside, and then I would forget where I put it or forget that I printed it and print it again. And this went on and on until we were actually moving. And when I was packing up my desk, I found like 5 copies of this article, like with increasingly urgent stickies, like read this, on the top, and I and still hadn't read it. So this feeling of we don't know where to start, I think he answers for us actually in that article, and which I finally did read, which is we have to start by actually doing the math. We need to figure out, well, we can never account for the humanity that was taken, the lives that were taken. Slavery was an economic, and that's what he's speaking about with the case for reparations. He's specifically speaking about slavery. You could apply this to other things as well, but in his case, he's talking about slavery, and it was an economic institution at the very least, and therefore there is a math that can be done to talk about what was taken and what is owed. And so his argument is, before you even get to how you would implement this, could you implement this? How would you pay out? Who would you pay out to? There's a million practical questions. His argument is, first do the math. Like actually understand what happened, and then you can worry about whether you do anything about it, or whether you do anything economically about it. But because we haven't actually done that, the reckoning part of it, partially because of these emotions that I described that keep nudging, but we keep pushing away, we're not even able to sort of assess the situation. And I found it really startling, by the way. I had not realized that the United States government has never apologized for slavery. Like there's never been a formal apology for it. And when slavery ended, reparations were given to the people who enslaved people, not to the people who were enslaved. Compensation was given for their lost property. And I did air quotes there. And so we know from research on apologies that apologies are actually, they're not the same as, actually undoing the wrong, but they are meaningful. And one of the reasons they're meaningful is that they, when someone receives an apology, even though it's about the past, the reason it's meaningful to people, according to research, is they see it as a reset for the future. It's actually a future-oriented action.
So if you're not even willing to apologize for the past,
right,
then it doesn't bode well for the future.
Exactly.
So I want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions. So I'm going to go look at the Q&A. But while I do that, I wanted to hear a little bit more about. I promised that we'd end with this idea of the gritty patriot.
Oh yeah.
And your paragon of the gritty patriot is George Takei.
Yeah.
And you talked to him, which was a great story in and of itself.
Right.
But tell us, I mean, you can tell us that story, but tell us his story and what makes him a gritty patriot.
Yeah, absolutely. So George is, you may know him as being on the original cast of Star Trek. You may know him from his massive social media following of 50 million followers or something right now. He is a celebrity who's been shockingly relevant for 50 years. You know, it's amazing longevity in terms of how long he's been in the public eye. What some people, but fewer people know about him than his sort of accomplishments in the arts is that when he was a young boy, he was born in Los Angeles in the 1930s, and when he was a young boy and World War II was underway and the U.S. and Japan went to war, he and his family were taken from their homes and put in internment camps. Internment camps being a sort of weird euphemism for being imprisoned behind barbed wires with guards with guns stopping you from leaving. He was 4 years old at the time. His family, as well as 120,000 other Japanese Americans, were imprisoned for crimes they had not committed. This was in anticipation of a crime they might commit. They were put behind barbed wire, and hundreds of miles from their homes. They lost their home. They lost the small business they ran. When years later the war ended, they were left homeless, jobless. It's sort of a stunning, very recent, this is in the lifetime of my parents, very recent event. And I wanted to talk to him about this. He's made it an important part of his legacy is to try to make sure people know what happened. He has a Broadway show that's now playing in London called Allegiance about this. He's written a best-selling book about it. And so I wanted to talk to him about it. The story that Dave is alluding to that's in the book is, how do you get in touch with George? I mean, like George Takei, like how does one do this? So, I was like trying different angles. I finally found someone who was willing very kindly to introduce me, or at least to forward an email from me to him. And in my email to George, which was this heartfelt, please talk to me. It ended with, I will do cartwheels if you say yes to this interview. And so it was just meant to be a figure of speech. However, I end up opening up my inbox to see an email from George Takei that began with, "I can't wait to see your cartwheel." And I was like, I haven't done a cartwheel in 40 years. So ended up, on my front lawn doing a very, very pathetic cartwheel with my kids cheering in the background and sending him that video. When we got on the phone for me to interview him, the call began with him singing "Hello, Dolly" to me, which I'm right now blushing, even like remembering the moment. So that's the story behind the interview with George. What I want to tell you about the interview with George is that he spoke about what happened to his family with pain still in his voice. He's in his 80s now, with, absolute conviction that wrong was done to his family and to so many others. And he also spoke of what a great president FDR was. FDR issued the executive order that imprisoned his family.
Yeah.
And so talk about embracing paradox. He's talked about what FDR did to, build the infrastructure of this country, to bring people together, and the ignorance he had that led to him making the decisions he did that affected George's family. And his ability to hold that paradox, his ability to see the importance of connecting the dots between what happened then to what's happening now and what could happen again, to seeing those as related, historical continuity, his ability to work through that patriot's dilemma. He loves this country like palpably. When he talks about the United States, it is with like a full embrace. And he also is dedicating, at a time when he could be resting, he is dedicating the rest of his years to helping make the United States aware of what we've done in the past so we can do better in the future. So the patriot's dilemma, he has found a way through it. So as I listened to him, I was just like, how is he doing this? How is it? How? And the term that came to me, and this is such a great forum to share this with, given that BCFG is Angela Duckworth and Katie Milkman's brainchild, the term that came to me is what grit he has. Grit, of course, is Angela and colleagues' work, where grit is passion and perseverance in pursuit of a meaningful long-term goal. And that's exactly what I heard in George, was this passion and perseverance, as opposed to an expectation that he should just be entitled to an easy love of country. It was, no, I have to apply passion and perseverance in pursuit of the love of country, the meaningful long-term goal that I care so deeply about. And so as I soaked up his way of being and loving his country, the term gritty patriot came to my mind. And that's what I took away, and where I end the book, spoiler alert, is this notion that that's what we all want to strive for, is being this active, agentic, gritty patriot. Grit will allow us to push through those moments that maybe, Ben Affleck wasn't able to push through in those moments, and give us the resilience to kind of recover from the shocks to our emotional system.
Mm-hmm. And with that resilience, that opens us to having a more realistic, more nuanced, clear-eyed view of where we are, where we come from, and therefore where we need to go.
Exactly. I actually think this is what we're looking for right now. I think some people are worried that like reckoning with this history is going to leave us, in the fetal position. And of course, there are moments where the brutal truth, you do want to go in the fetal position, but I actually think it's going to leave us more hopeful, more inspired, more confident, more empowered, because things will make more sense. Like, this world we're in with all these disparities, all these biases, it did not come out of thin air. We built it this way. That means we can unbuild it, we can fix it, but we have to know what we're dealing with. We have to reverse engineer how we got here, and then we can deal with it going forward. So I actually, now that I have, done better than I did 10 years ago and trying to reckon with this whitewashed history, I actually feel more empowered.
So I want to turn it over to the audience now. And one of the questions, I'm going to just read it here instead of trying to summarize it. The attendee says, I could see your ideas about holding two truths being turned around on cancel culture. For example, people who may believe that the founding fathers' slave ownership is their defining feature and negates all their extraordinary accomplishments that you talked about. Is what you're talking about a both sides issue, or is there more responsibility for those who are privileged and powerful to figure out how to handle two truths at once?
I listen.
Yeah, so let's parse that a little bit together.
Yeah.
So if I were to rephrase that, I would be thinking about how do you think about going back in history, right? So we're taking down Confederate monuments.
Yeah.
That's one thing. But then there are other people whose legacy is more mixed.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
What does it mean when we make choices for today about how we want to represent our past? So how do you think of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is a little bit like the reparations conversation. Like, we can make those choices once we know what it is that we're dealing with. So we can talk about the Jefferson Memorial once we're willing to talk about Jefferson's enslavement of people. But I don't even think we're at that point yet where we can have that, like, should we cancel Jefferson or shouldn't we conversation, because we haven't actually reckoned with knowing what was the reality, what were the wonderful things and what were the terrible things that Thomas Jefferson did. There's a story I tell in the book about a company called Dixie Beer, which was the oldest brewery in New Orleans. And this was a family, run brewery for a long time, a very loyal following locally. They brought in a new general manager with with Katrina. Their production facilities had been disrupted, and they wanted to like bring production back into the city and revive this brand. And they were all set to do it. And one of the sort of key pillars of their business strategy was they wanted to move into more of a national distribution plan. And so they started like talking to buyers nationally, and folks started saying things like, "Are you guys okay with your name? Dixie Beer is their name." And they were like, "Sure, why not? What do you mean?" And they were like, "Well, Dixie for many people has connotations and clear connections to the Confederacy." Now, there's lots of controversy over where the word Dixie came from. That's actually like a disputed thing, but there isn't a lot of ambiguity over what the Confederacy stood for. If you look at, the data, it's actually pretty clear what their tenets were. And so suddenly this company that was actually about to double down on their Dixie Beer brand stopped and was like, wait, maybe we shouldn't double down on the Dixie Beer brand. Maybe we should like do a deeper dive into understanding it. And this was taking place before May of 2020, but it led into May of 2020. They were already having these discussions, and they ended up doing a full reset and renaming themselves Faubourg Beer, which speaks to a word that's used widely in New Orleans. That Faubourg refers to like a community or a neighborhood. And I'm telling the story to get to what I thought was the most interesting finding or discovery from the leaders of the company, or the Jim Birch, who I talked to, the general manager, which was once they actually changed the name, they started hearing from potential customers in the Black community that I had never complained about the name, but I could never defend it either. And that was feedback they had never heard before until they changed the name.
Yeah.
So sometimes when we're having these debates, we're not even hearing the full conversation. There's fatigue, there's exhaustion from, sort of speaking up that's creating divides that I know we don't want in our communities.
Yeah. One more question I have from, it sounds like it is from one of your former students, who's interested in the evolution of your research from bounded ethicality to your previous book, The Person You Mean to Be, to this new book. And she's asking, what is one big idea you've grappled with over time? Yeah,
thank you. Always great to hear from former students. The big idea for me, the umbrella idea, is the psychology of good people. And by that, I'm referring to this identity that we hold so tightly, that we cling to, of wanting to see ourselves as a good person, that's threaded through the work with Mahzarin Banaji and Max Beserman on bounded ethicality, where we looked at the ways in which that image we have of ourselves as, I think we said, moral, competent, and deserving, that identity gets in the way of us actually being able to sort of recognize and notice things that contradict that identity. And so that original work in my mind led to The Person You Mean to Be, where I talked about on an individual level with our individual identities, how we deal with self-threat to our good person identity. And I offered, as you said so nicely at the beginning, being goodish as a way to counter that. And then we bring that to the current book, where now it's our social identity as Americans, or our social identity tied to our families, that the social identity threat makes it difficult for us to see things beyond that. So there's a big theme that I think Max Beserman has really helped me think about noticing and what we do and don't notice when we're stuck in those very particular brittle identities. And the psychology of good people is, for me, the study of how do we not get stuck in those identities? How do we notice more, and how do we grow more?
So we've got just a couple of minutes left here. Now is the time I'm supposed to do the outro, but we have, I wanted to, there was a question, there's two questions, one from Germany, one from Brazil.
Okay.
The German question was about reckoning how patriotism, feels like it's too soon for patriotism in Germany, and how do you, like, that's an alien concept. And you're talking about sort of resolving these two concepts. And then Louise from Brazil was asking, how would you, are there ways to gently introduce your research and your argument to more radical groups, like the Proud Boys he's suggesting here? But is this an argument, to paraphrase, is this an argument for people who are ready but grappling with how to reckon with our history? Or could you introduce this question to somebody who really,
yeah, I understand,
is disinterested?
Yeah, so let me start with the second one, and then I'll go to the first one. So, and I know we're short on time, so I'll do short, unnuanced answers. I think in terms of who the audience is, I don't claim to have the expertise to speak to radical or extreme audiences. I think where I'm most skilled in my work is to people, as you said, who are interested but are looking for tools. And so I don't think this is the book, if you have a family member and falls in that category, I don't think this is the book to hand to them. But if you have a family member, or yourself, even better, who is interested in learning more, but you notice that you always sort of, like I did with that article, it just always keeps being put aside, I think this book is a good place to start for that. In terms of, is it too soon for patriotism? I think it depends. I'm trying to redefine how I think about patriotism as not being like what I wear, but kind of sort of how I think. And that gritty patriot idea, I do not think it's too soon for. In fact, we're overdue for it, I would say, at least I am personally, because that's this gritty notion of seeing things as they are, dressing for the weather, connecting the dots, rejecting racial fables. These are all the tools that I offer in the book. It's active and agentic. Is it too? I don't think it's ever too soon. I mean, I think it's always too soon or too late for what I would call empty or sort of, patriotism, which is something where it's just easy to love everything about our country. We can't parent that way, and I don't think we can love our country that way. We have to see the whole and love the whole, even if we don't always like the whole.
And so it's possible to be proud of something while at the same time recognizing that there are elements of it that you would not feel proud of, you might even feel ashamed of.
That's right. In fact, I would hope that, right? Like if we're not feeling some shame around some of these realities of our history, I mean, I bet every person listening here would feel some shame if they read. Like I'm not saying we should feel personal shame like it was our fault, but we should feel some negative emotion. What I'm trying to offer in the book is like, and this is maybe where, when you ask me about like, the radical groups, people who aren't necessarily in the deep radical group, but who are in the camp of, why should I sit in shame, and why should my children sit in shame? I think what I'm trying to offer is, this isn't either or, like, should you feel shame or shouldn't you? It's natural to feel some of those emotions. In fact, it seems like the kind of very human response one would expect. The question is just, can we dress for the weather and deal with it, as opposed to just, put ourselves in a position where we don't even know about it.
Yeah, because if you're not ashamed of that in the past, then what's stopping it from happening again in the future?
Right.
Certainly.
Right.
Certainly is true. So Dolly, I really, really want to thank you for being here. I'm excited for the launch of your book that I've already had a chance put it on the other side. I can't reach it right now, but I've already had a chance to get an early copy of. And so I also want to thank BCFG and special thanks to Alyssa Newland and Alex Lusher for helping on the back end today. To the audience, we will see you back here on November 11th for Harvard's Max Bazerman, who will be talking about his new book, Complicit. Dolly knows Max pretty well.
And I read the book. The book is so good.
Yeah, so you'll want to read. There's some very sort of relevant things, but very personal, where Max gets into his own complicity in a way that I think makes the book really more profoundly moving. If you're registered for this talk, you're already registered for the talk with Max, so you'll get a reminder email when that is getting closer. You'll also get an email with the recording for this talk. If you'd like to stay updated on the work we're doing at Zeitgeist, you can subscribe to our newsletter. That link should be in the chat. And we will send that link out again in our wrap-up newsletter. So thank you again, Dolly. Wonderful to have you. Tremendous book. Highly recommend everybody reading it. And thanks to everybody for coming. We'll see you in November.
Thank you so much, Dave.